The American economy is navigating a complex landscape shaped by President Trump's economic policies, balancing protectionism with global competitiveness. His focus on reshoring manufacturing has sparked debate about its impact on both domestic and global markets. Aimed at addressing trade imbalances, this approach has altered global trade relations, particularly with China and Europe. European leaders such as Macron and Schulz are concerned about the long-term effects on economic cooperation. As they discuss strategies to shield Europe from Trump's pressure, the future of the world economy remains uncertain amid these evolving challenges. Today in this episode, we'll explore the implications of Trump's approach and the global response. Welcome to In Depth.
Donald Trump is his name, and he's there to stay.
As unlikely, impossible, is now reality.
We will make America powerful. We will win, win, win. And we will make America great again. Let's do it already, terrorists. We will very quickly make America great again.
Washington Post has stated that before taking office, President Trump ramped up his rhetoric against China, threatening tariffs as high as 60% on Chinese imports. However, in his first days back in the White House, he refrained from broad attacks on China, instead focusing on higher tariffs for Mexico and Canada. Amid this, China has sought a reset in US-China relations, emphasizing a cooperative approach to trade. Beijing has avoided direct threats, expressing a willingness to negotiate over trade imbalances. Additionally, China has shown flexibility regarding Trump's TikTok proposal, advocating for market-driven decisions. In response to Trump's claims about the Panama Canal, the Beijing or the Chinese government distanced itself, asserting it doesn't manage the canal's operations. Europe's economy has started 2025 with cautious growth as the Eurozone Composite Purchasing Managers Index rose slightly to 50.2 in January, indicating a modest rebound in private sector activity. According to Wall Street Journal, despite this, ongoing concern about high US tariffs on European exports temper optimism, and weak economic conditions raise expectations that the European Central Bank will cut interest rates in the coming months. While the Eurozone's manufacturing sector showed slight improvements, services growth slowed and labor market weakness persists. European policymakers face challenges from stagnant wages, tougher export competition, and regulatory barriers. Meanwhile, contrasting economic performance with the US suggests differing monetary policies, with the European Central Bank expected to cut rates faster than the US Federal Reserves.
China will.
President Donald Trump's economic policies have prominently featured tariffs, particularly targeting China. In a recent video speech at Davos, he celebrated what he called the golden age of America, urging businesses to manufacture domestically or face potential tariffs. He announced plans to impose a 10% tariff on Chinese imports starting February 1, 2025, as part of his ongoing efforts to address trade imbalances. Trump's administration has historically used tariffs as a tool of economic protectionism, with some earlier tariffs reaching as high as 60% during his campaign. These measures sparked the Trump-China trade war, leading to retaliatory tariffs from China and other trading partners. Despite these developments, recent reports suggest that Chinese exports have continued to rise, raising questions about the effectiveness of Trump's strategy.
In the United States because they
The European Union has also been a target of Trump's tariffs, with the US administration claiming unfair treatment. Reactions from global leaders have been mixed. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau warned of potential retaliatory measures if Trump proceeds with additional tariffs. Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz met in Paris to strategize against US trade pressures. Macron asserted that Europe is capable of defending itself against US tariffs, while Scholz described the current economic climate as challenging for the continent. In contrast, China's vice premier has advocated for cooperative trade solutions, emphasizing dialogue over confrontation. As Trump navigates these complex international relations, the long-term implications of his tariff policies remain uncertain, raising concerns among business leaders about the potential economic repercussions.
Could President Trump's tariffs on China pave the way for a golden age of America, or risk economic isolation? As he plans a 10% tariff on Chinese imports, what are the potential impacts on international relations and domestic businesses? For more analysis, we're joined by Mr. Peter Tanis, an economic expert from Washington, and we're also joined by Mr. Ashraf El-Ashri, managing editor of Al-Ahram newspaper from Cairo. Good afternoon, both gentlemen, and welcome to Qnews. Let me start here with Mr. Tanis. Now, how will President Trump's proposed tariffs impact the U.S. economy in 2025?
We've talked about this before, and I mentioned in the past that the tariffs he talked about during the campaign, 60% on China, 10% on just about everybody else, and more recently, 25% on Canada and Mexico, were a fantasy, because tariffs of that sort would be highly inflationary. They would raise prices in the United States and would provoke inflation again. And Trump knows this because it's pretty obvious. So now he's talking about a 10% tariff, which obviously would be much less onerous on the United States. And we still haven't gotten to Canada and Mexico yet. But as I said before, most of these tariff talks are a negotiating strategy, and we haven't seen the end of it.
Right, indeed. We'll get to what exactly is meant by negotiating terms and what aims for, but let me here get to Mr. El-Ashri first. What potential retaliatory measures could other countries take in response to Trump's tariffs, do you think?
مساء الخير
Good afternoon
الخير للسادة
to
المشاهدين.
you
بكل
and
تأكيد
to your
هناك
people,
بالفعل
the
فترة
viewer.
عصيبة
Certainly,
بلغت
there is a very
الحساسية في
harsh
قادم
time
الأيام
and a
تظن
very
أن
sensitive
الرئيس
in the
ترامب
upcoming
سواء في
times
خطاب
in light
التنصيب
of the announcement
وأداء
of
اليمين
Trump
الدستورية أو
during
حتى في
the
خطابه
inauguration
بالأمس في
speech
دافوس
and
عبر
even
كونفرنس
his speech in
لمجتمعينا في
Davos.
دافوس وأعتقد أنه تحدث
And
عن
I
مجموعة
think that he
الإجراءات
talked
الاقتصادية
about
بلغت الصعوبة
the very harsh
بسبب إجراءات
economic measures
العديد عن
imposing
الدول
and
الاتحاد
tax
الأوروبي
duties
وحتى عقاب روسيا
European Union and
توقف
China
تسريب
and
الاقتراحات
even
الخاصة
Russia if it is
بحل
not
الأزمة
gotten in
الأوكرانية.
line
بالتالي
with the
الصين
Ukraine
وأوروبا
crisis.
كل
China
قسم
and Europe
ماذا سوف
very
يفعل
concerned
بالخاص
about
بفرض
the
إجراءات
retaliation of
تطبيقات
Putin
أيضا
and
على السلع
more
النمطية الأمريكية
tax
وبالتالي ربما يؤدي هذا الأمر إلى
measures
ثمة
on the
كبيرة
American
من
goods, and I
زيادة
think
التضخم
it would
في الأسعار
increase the
النقدية
inflation that the
وانعكاساتها حتى على
United
التضخم
States, its
الدولي
impact,
خاصة أن هذا الأمر في الساعات
ramifications
الماضية التي ارتفعت الأسواق
internationally,
العالمية بعد خطاب بايدن
particularly in the
ترامب
last hours,
وأن الأمر يشير إلى أن يكون
that
زيادة
had an
التحالفات
effect in
النقدية
the
بين
exchange
الصين
rate and
وبين الولايات
increasing
المتحدة
in
ونفس
the
الأمر
tax
سيكون بين
tariffs
أيضا
between China and the
الاتحاد
USA
الأوروبي
and between the
والاتحاد
European
الأفريقي
Union
وربما
and the USA,
تتعثر
and it
في تصدير
might
السيارات
many
وبعض
exportation
القطع
of
وبعض
automotives
المنتجات
and some
بأمريكا
other
في
European
ضوء
goods
ما
to
قرره ترامب
America
بفرض إجراءات
in light of what has
قوية
been
وعقابية
laid
على
down
كل
by
من الأطراف
Trump
التي
in
ترفض
imposing all the
الإجراءات الجمركية
international parts
وتخفيض الإجراءات
of
الجمركية بشأن السلع
decreasing in
الأمريكية
the tax
وأعتقد
measures
هذا
regarding
المشهد
the
الذي
US
كلنا
goods. And I
نتفائل
think
مع
that
حضراتكم
would
وربما يكون
create a
الاقتصاد
state
العالمي
of
في الأشهر
inflation
القادمة
and economic
ستصدرها
recession
ترامب
in the
بنفس
upcoming
الإجراءات
months.
القاسية والعقابية بشأن فرض
If
إجراءات
Trump's
جمركية وبعض الحالات
continue,
الإدارة
do you
الدولية
his proposals to lead recession and inflation in USA before China and European Union.
Right. Mr. Tanis, what did you mean exactly by a negotiation strategy? And how do Trump's tariffs on China influence global trade relations and supply chains?
Well, there's certain aspects of tariffs on China that are important. For example, there's a 100% tariff in the United States on Chinese electric vehicles. Chinese electric vehicles almost destroyed the market in Europe until they put a tariff on them too. Why? Because the Chinese make the best electric vehicles of anybody in the world, and they would destroy the market everywhere else if they were allowed to come in because they're a lot cheaper. So tariffs do have a place, but massive tariffs like Trump has proposed simply do not work. And when I say negotiating strategy, it's because of this. Most foreign leaders know that a rational counterparty, if the United States president was a rational person, there would not be talk about imposing tariffs that would have a terrible effect on both sides. The trouble is, they think Trump is a little bit crazy. So they worry that even if it doesn't make sense, he might impose them anyway. And this gives Trump a terrific negotiating stance because people are afraid of him. The purpose of the negotiations is to try to get some tariff income to the United States in a small amount that would not be inflationary and would also protect American markets like electric vehicles where it needs protecting.
Mr. Ashri, how might China's partnerships with Russia and other nations influence the ability to manage tensions with the US?
It is expected strongly, particularly that there are several of strategic allies economically and strategically, and this would lead to create measures by China towards the USA, particularly that China warned lately if Trump imposes great tariffs against for the Chinese importers that will retaliate, that would escalate the tensions between China and the US economically. And we do not forget that the threat of Trump in imposing 100% tariffs and tax against the countries of the BRICS that impose tax measures of 100%, which is a very wondering that entering in a great war economically between Egypt and the countries of the BRICS. But the expected war is going to be expected to be between the USA and China, as there are punishment measures by Trump, and not only economically but politically, when they requested the EU in paying 5% of GDP in supporting the budget of the NATO. So the economic and political factors will be entangled and susceptible and affected the trade relations and the tax and the custom relations between USA and the rest of the countries. And Trump would gain any gains instead of providing any gains for the others in return.
Mr. Tanis, you said that Trump, in a way or another, is unexpected, and this is why who deals with him is very cautious, particularly when we're speaking about states. Now, how might the European Union, from your point of view, respond to Trump's threats of increased tariffs, and how will that reflect on the transatlantic relations?
Yes. Obviously, it would not have a very good effect on relations with some of our strongest allies, which are in Europe. But the thing about the trade with Europe, remember, is that that goes both ways. Europe imports an awful lot of American goods and services. So if we impose tariffs on Europe broadly, they're going to retaliate, and that is going to hurt American exporters quite a lot. So what does that mean? That means it's not going to happen. Or there may be some small tariffs that have minor effects on the economy, but the idea of 10 or 20% tariffs across the board on everything is a fantasy because of the consequences for both sides, which are purely negative.
Mr. Ashri, now, from your point of view, how realistic is Trump's assertion that cutting oil prices could immediately end the Russian-Ukraine war? And what are the broader geopolitical implications of such a move or a claim?
I think it is a demand and a desire by when Trump directed his speech to Saudi Arabia and Davis in his speech that the prices of the oil decreased as the Europlus group of Saudi Arabia and Russia that controlled this bloc, and they agreed of the ceiling of production and prices. So it's going to be hard for the Saudi to respond Trump's demand strictly, as there is the Russian side, and so it will be in a dilemma of decreasing the oil prices in order to solve the problem of the Ukrainian and Russian war. And Saudi has an economic partnership in the field of oil and gas with this group, firstly the Russia. And therefore, there will be have a possible of negotiations and following ending the crisis between Russia and Ukraine and taken into consideration to have several of economic group to pave the way of agreement by decreasing the prices. But I think in the near future it isn't expected as the war still exists. In addition, there's a deal between Saudi Arabia and America of investment of $600 billion US, but Trump is requesting for $1 trillion US, and I think that would have great impact economically. And I don't think that would be an attempt of decreasing the prices in the oil in light of the international economic crisis and the U.S. interest with other partners such as OPEC and OPEC Plus, and then will be have maybe need more months to determine the prices of the oil, maybe in the half of the next year, or this year rather, I think.
Right. Mr. Tanis, how do Trump's economic policies align with historical trends in U.S. protectionism?
We're talking about oil?
No, we're speaking about his decisions at large, but definitely the emergency cutting of energy and definitely oil has great impact also.
Yes, I'm not sure I understood the question, but I think I did. The one.
Do you want me to repeat it in a way?
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Yes. So I'm speaking here about Trump's economic policies. And do they align with historical trends in U.S. protectionism? You said, you spoke, are we speaking about energy? I said, no, we're speaking about the U.S. Economy at large. But why not speaking about the energy cuts as well?
Sure. Okay, let's start with the energy.
Okay.
As you know, one of the first things he did after he was inaugurated was to remove restrictions on drilling that had been imposed by the Biden administration. That means that the United States, which is already the largest producer of oil in the world, is going to produce even more oil, and that would have an immediate effect of lowering the price of oil. Long term, it may not have much of an effect, but for the moment, that is not going to be helpful in terms of the price of oil. To the answer, the protectionist point that you made, which is a very important point. The fact is that there are two aspects to this. Number one, the Trump administration wants fair trade deals with all of its partners, at least the way it views fair trade. It thinks that some of our trading partners are subsidizing and therefore getting in, frankly, giving an unfair advantage, and he wants to correct that.
Mr. Ashry, from your point of view, what could be the strategies by European leaders like Macron and Schulz, for instance, considering, or what are they considering to counter Trump's economic pressures?
Certainly, there are a great European concern, and started lately following the inauguration of Trump. We'll find that the German Chancellor took in a very difficult time with European countries and the USA, and some requested to have and demanded European economic management, even to establish a European army away of NATO in order to avoid clashes with Trump. That this would produce several of default that would create trade and economic war between Europe and the USA in Era's administration, and of course this would affect the trade exchange between USA and the European countries and affected negatively with the possibilities of the trade movements between European Union and the USA. Particularly, Trump warned Europe, you bring your cars to sell it in USA market without allowing the American goods to enter Europe. Therefore, I would resort to the very serious measures against European countries, and that would affect the economic and trade relations, particularly EU that aren't very much assured, taking into consideration that Trump won't allow often balance the relation without having any winning and serve the interest of USA. So would go for deals economically and trade that's harder to be marketing economically and politically, but this would rely on the primary dialogue between USA and the international countries to avoid spare the other relations with China and other countries. And Trump should reconsider that would lead in a very great economic crisis and a high prices and some recession of the international movement.
Mr. Thanos, getting back to you now, how likely is it that the NATO countries would agree to Trump's calls for a 5% GDP defense spending target, and what could be the challenges facing or they face in meeting such a demand from your point of view?
Are you talking about 5% for defense?
The President Trump has already asked and called for the NATO members to raise the expenditures of the war to 5% instead of 2%. So from your point of view, will they be able to meet such an issue? What challenges do they meet in meeting that? What do you think about this particular call?
Yeah, it's a non-starter. Of course, the European nations aren't going to agree to it. European nations had a hard time with 2%. And when Trump was president the last time around, he was able, very few of them even met the 2% threshold. He was able to get most of them back up to 2%, which was fair and a victory for Trump. But to say that they're going to go from 2 to 5%, none of the European countries will be able to afford that. So I think that's probably dead in the water.
Right. If I may ask you here, Mr. Ashry, how does the shifting focus of U.S. trade policies shifting from China to Mexico and Canada affect the global economic landscape?
Are a great and several concerns throughout the countries, and are very cautious. And what would Trump deal do later on? All Trump's statement of annexing Panama Island and Greenland and to control the Panama Canal, all this matter would trigger the concern, particularly the statements of the world leaders regarding the relations with Trump and his 4-year term in the U.S. administration. And that would also lead that there is an uncertainty internationally, and particularly in the trade and economic ties, and a concern of increasing the tension. He said that would extinguish or end the wars in the world. And what about in return? Is the imposing tariffs and that would impose on Europe and China and the international community would affect his ties with them, along with NATO.
Yes, that's so clear, Mr. Ashri. Of course, remains to be seen what would be the effect exactly. That was Mr. Peter Tanis, an economic expert, and Mr. Ashraf Al-Ashri, managing editor of Al-Ahram newspaper. We thank you both, gentlemen, for your valuable insights. And that brings us to the end of today's episode of In Depth. Many thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more updates on Qnews.